Chapter 3 First Contacts. Entry 27. The United Systems and Colonies, USC, is the only non-hostile multi-space government that is currently known to exist across our galaxy. It is currently composed of 3 main races, as well as several others that have accepted the embrace of the USC in order to begin their first steps towards a new era. Formed in 2891, the USC is the result of the alliance between the humans and the Lockeran. In 2892, both races began to openly accept each other's members into their respective territories, and the construction of several mixed-space colonies was approved. By 2905, the cultural exchange between both races had been a success. The newly established colonies were flourishing, and both races had warmly accepted each other. During the year 2908, the Getgar Republic made first contact with one of the mixed-race colonies on the USC's border. The exchange was a success, and both sides agreed to host a meeting between the 2 chancellors of the USC and the High Matriarch of the Getgar Republic. Subsequently, both sides acknowledged each other as allies. In 2936, after the Genesis War, the Getgar Republic ceased to exist, and instead, the Getgar merged with the USC, forming the government we know today. The Genesis War was a massive conflict that actively lasted 10 Terran years. It involved the newly formed USC, the Getgar Republic, and the Servan. It boiled down to 2 sides, the USC and the Republic against the Servan. The Servan are a machine race with no known origin, which unleashed an insidious bioengineered virus upon the human race through the 2900s to 2905. The exact date is unknown. This nanovirus severely hindered the human birth rate and caused humanity to go into a steady decline for several years. The virus itself remained unnoticed for more than 10 years. Then, in the year 2915, the birth rate for humans dropped dramatically as thousands of miscarriages began occurring simultaneously. Having debilitated the human race, who had been the bulk of the USC's power until then, the Servan began to attack their colonies, breaking them down one by one. The USC was unable to form a proper defense in most cases, and the aid provided by the Getgar Republic arrived too late. The Servan infantry towered over the USC's and the Republic's in terms of sheer power, and many attempts to defend the colonies often result in failure. Weakened by its diminishing numbers, the USC began to invest more resources into the Savior Project. Upon discovering this virus, several 100,000 of subjects were chosen out of the 1 million volunteers. They received various forms of genetic treatment and prototypical antidotes in hopes of counteracting the Servan bioweapon and augmenting the human physique to level the fight against the Serran forces. The results were more than spectacular. Over the course of a year, not only was the bioweapon nullified, the project also discovered the average human seemed to accept genetic changes surprisingly well, due to having a fairly malleable genetic code. Scientists were able to augment muscle mass, muscle density, bone density, height, etc. The downside was that the more changes they made to the DNA, the more likely it was for the subject to turn sterile, regardless of the virus. A cure was produced, along with a relatively short-term gene treatment made to augment the human body, which altered the human physique while still ensuring that the subjects remained fertile. Even so, the project's mortality rate was nearly 80%. Through the reverse engineering of Servan technology, several breakthroughs were made in the fields of nanotechnology and biomechanical engineering. By combining this research with the physical augmentation already in use, the USC was able to create infantry capable of effectively stopping the Servan assaults. In the year 2935, A detachment of the USC fleet intercepted a single Servan carrier headed towards loomed, one of the colonies within Getgar territory. The carrier was captured, and it was discovered that the ship was harboring several containers of strange blue substance. Further analysis revealed that the substance was composed of very aggressive nanomachines, which upon contact with most forms of biological tissue would immediately start to decompose it, breaking it down on a molecular level in the course of mere hours. It was immediately secured and shipped to the nearest research facility. An order was issued to every available USC vessel to assume defensive positions on the most vulnerable colonies. 12 days later, the Servan launched an attack on Gorgol, a mixed-race colonies of Lakaran and humans, which was orbited and defended by a York-class space station, a small detachment of 3 destroyers and 5 frigates. With a fleet made up of 6 carriers, 11 frigates, and 7 destroyers, the Servan launched their attack with brutal force. They targeted the space station at first, making use of several boarding parties in order to disable it, as the facility possessed a mass-accelerated cannon that ran through the entire length of it, which posed a great threat to their fleet. They were met with heavy resistance by part of the station's crew, who managed to bring down 3 Sovereign destroyers, severely damaging one of their carriers, and take out 2 lesser vessels before the station's command center was seized. However, while the Servan were cutting through the defensive line of the USC, a few of their frigates had already reached the USC's perimeter and were wreaking havoc upon the cities of Korgolo. A slipspace rupture was torn as the USS Phobos, a Mars-class super dreadnought, entered the battle zone, backed up by 2 carriers, 3 destroyers, and 3 frigates. The battle that followed was brutal. The Phobos ravaged the unsuspecting Servan, who began to accelerate towards the planet. With only 2 carriers and a few frigates left, the Servan continued to approach the planet. The Phobos had the only destroyer that was still operational and took down one of the carriers. Unfortunately, they were not capable of reloading in time to take down the other carrier. While the vessel continued to make its approach towards the planet, the space station began to turn, as if trying to aim at the carrier. The Servan were not able to react in time. The slow, massive carrier was struck on its side by an equally large station, unfortunately causing the destruction of both carrier and the space station. 15 minutes afterwards, the USC had managed to neutralize the rest of the Servan fleet. Later assignments discovered that the Servan carriers had been loaded with the same nanovirus found on the vessels headed towards loomed. It was speculated that their objective was the mass extermination of Korgolo's populace. However, the battle was not won without its losses. The USC's fleet had been obliterated. Only a single frigate and the USS Phobos remained, which was decommissioned the next day. Afterwards, it was restored and had been orbiting the planet Mars ever since, serving as a museum space station. The USC has been in alert since the Battle of Korgolo, even though the Servan have not been sighted to this day. A year and a half later, as negotiations continued whilst gaining strength for a possible Servan offense, the Getgar Republic was disbanded and instead merged with the USC. The date the Getgar joined the USC, November 29th, 2936, has been formally recognized as the end of the Genesis War. End of entry. All across the vast apple orchard, hundreds if not thousands of bright fruits that hung from each tree shone radiantly as the sunlight washed over their glossy surfaces. Unlike Ponyville, Sweet Apple Acres was far enough from town to avoid being obscured by the shadow of the vector, managing to keep his usual optimistic and blissful demeanor. In the middle of the expansive apple orchard, a red barn that stood proudly, and right next to it, as one would expect, a farmhouse, painted the same color as the fruit that the farm was famous for. The leaves of the many apple trees ruffled gently as the soft midday breeze swept past them. It was perfectly peaceful, and almost a perfectly silent paradise. A rather loud thumping sound caused by a pair of mechanical legs interrupted the silence, though, coupled by the high-pitched voices of 3 excited fillies. 6 shapes could be seen walking under the hot glare of the sun along the road that led to the center of the apple orchard. 2 humans, an android, and 3 little fillies, one for each type of pony, and each of them as colorful and joyful as the world that surrounded them. Atlas, Taurus, and Mac walked along with the 3 ponies. During the first few minutes of their journey, the gruff troopers had been victims of a barrage of questions provided by the fillies, but soon enough, the little creatures had run out of questions, and thankfully, the 3 travelers had managed to avoid most of the delicate inquiries.
Could you guys slow down, please?
A rather tired-looking Sweetie Belle looked up at Mac. The rest of the group came to a halt and turned around to look at the little unicorn. The humans and the android looked at each other, shrugging. "Are we moving too quickly, Sweetie Belle?" asked Mac, with his typical cybernetic monotone. The little white unicorn scratched the back of her head with a hoof.
Well, yeah, or wait, no. I don't know, it's just, you guys can cover a lot of ground with just one step.
The other 2 fillies looked up. Scootaloo spoke up.
Well, yeah, kinda. But I don't mind. It doesn't tire me out anyways.
Atlas shrugged. "Well, still though, we could go faster." He knelt down in front of Apple Bloom and motioned towards his shoulder. "Come on, hop on."
Huh?
She gave him a confused look.
Sorry, but y'all, walk on 2 legs? So I think I might kind of fall right off your back when you stand up.
Atlas shook his head. "No, not like that. Look, climb up, I'll show you." He then leaned down a bit more.
Well, alright.
Apple Bloom walked up to him and began to climb up, stepping on his knees. Atlas helped her up, placing the little filly on his back. "All you have to do is sit on the base of my neck. Let your legs hang around my sides, and then wrap your arms, or 4 legs, around my head. Just make sure you don't cover my eyes." Following Atlas's instructions, she sat on his back and placed her hind legs around his neck, letting them hang down. "Okay, now hold on to my head," Atlas said. The filly did as she was told, wrapping her 4 legs around Atlas's head.
Are y'all sure you can see? Whoa!
Atlas stood up, with Apple Bloom holding tightly onto him as the blood rushed out of her head and instead pushed down to the rest of her body. It took her a moment to get rid of the dizziness. She then took a look at her surroundings, noticing that everything was smaller.
Whoa,
she said, looking around. She was now taller than any of the apple trees planted across the farm, and was able to see the hills that stood around Ponyville. Atlas cleared his throat. "You can stop covering my eyes now." Apple Bloom giggled sheepishly as she changed her grip on Atlas's head. Taurus knelt down and allowed Scootaloo to climb up on her head and sit in the same manner Apple Bloom was, but carefully avoiding the sharp metallic wings.
Whoa, cool! Hey, do you think you can fly with me on your back?
She asked. Taurus shook her head. "I told you it's too loud. Besides, I don't think you'll be able to hold on anyways," she said. The purple-maned filly groaned and rolled her eyes. The only ones left were Sweetie Belle and Mac, who stared at her coldly. She crossed her legs and averted her eyes from him. Slowly Mac knelt down, offering his hand to her. "Do you want me to carry you now?" It was noticeable that he made an attempt to sound a little bit more comforting, but he ended up just sounding the same as he always did. Blunt. She looked up at him, gazing into his cold eyes, and then looked away again.
No, it's fine."
Almost immediately afterward, he asked again. "Please?" "Please?" he asked, exactly as before, like someone had taken a recording of him and replayed it. The little unicorn sighed, looking up at Mac's glowing blue eyes.
"Okay, I guess."
She awkwardly climbed up. Mac placed his hand under her hooves, helping her up. After Sweetie Belle sat on the base of his neck, Mac steadily stood up, and then looked to the rest of the group.
See? It's not so bad,
Taurus said, holding back a chuckle. Scootaloo snickered.
I knew Sweetie would get the weird one.
After her statement, Max shot her a burning glance, making her look ahead and whistle like nothing had happened. Well, let's get moving, Atlas said. Apple Bloom bobbed up and down with each of Atlas's steps. She had to admit, even if she didn't know much about him, she did feel a bit comfortable with the Titan. He had a somewhat friendly yet gruff demeanor. The point of view she had from sitting upon his shoulders was just amazing. No longer was she bound to the height that came with being a filly. She proceeded to rest her head on top of Atlas. Then she closed her eyes, imagining the look on her sister's face as Apple Bloom looked down at her and said,
"Who's the big pony now, huh?" "Hey, how fast can you go?"
asked Scootaloo.
"When flying, well, I can break the sound barrier if you know what that means," said Taurus.
Scootaloo's jaw hung open.
"Whoa, so you can make like a sonic rain boom?" "A sonic rain boom? I don't know what that is, but I can make a sonic boom for sure."
Behind her helmet, the woman's lips curled into a smile.
"Hey, how fast do you think the Vector can go?" "You mean that huge thing floating up there? Well, duh, something that big must go like super slow."
Taurus clicked her tongue, dismissing Scootaloo's argument.
"It can go faster than light. It can move so fast you can't even see it. So fast that it could spin around the world 1,000 times, and even a millisecond aren't small enough to time it. And it can also go into space."
To say Scootaloo was dumbfounded would be an understatement. Her mind had been absolutely blown.
"How could that thing move so incredibly fast?" she thought. "She must be lying. And in space? I don't even..."
As she eventually became overloaded with her own questions, Scootaloo decided to let it go for now, to let her brain cool down. It was not often that Sweetie Belle felt awkward. She thought that Mac was scary. His voice was weird and he felt cold. She was not exactly holding on to him tight. Even the thought of him complaining about her grip being too hard was kind of scary. She sighed and looked up, resting her forelegs on top of Mac's head. As she did so, she began to slip off. The android's shoulder. She was about to fall down when a pair of cold hands gently stopped her from doing so. "Are you okay, Sweetie Belle?" Mac's tone had changed. He really did sound like he was somewhat concerned, but his regular bluntness was still somewhat present.
"Oh, yeah, thanks."
She readjusted her position, and Max slowly allowed his arms to go back to their regular location. "Please hold on to me as tight as you want. It doesn't matter to me. Besides, it is my duty to protect." After he finished talking, he noticed that Taurus and the rest of the group were looking at him as they walked. "Is something wrong?" he asked.
"Oh, it's nothing," said Taurus with a laugh.
Scootaloo smiled.
"Did you see how fast his arms went? It was like wham!"
"Believe it or not, sweetie, he may look cold and scary on the outside, but that's just because he has trouble expressing himself. I think he actually kind of cares about you," said Atlas, and then he added a chuckle.
"Aw, is that true, Mac?"
asked Taurus. Mac continued to stare ahead. "I will neither acknowledge nor deny," he stated. Atlas smiled. So far, he and the others had been enjoying themselves. A stray thought crossed his mind, turning his smile into a frown behind his faceplate. Maybe a little too much. The group reached the farm. Apple Bloom's house was just a few meters up ahead. It was a warm-looking, rather rustic farmhouse. The doors were tiny compared to those humans were used to, but after all, it belonged to ponies. Atlas walked up to the front door and leaned inside to take a look in the window. Inside the house, no form of activity could be seen. Old yet well-preserved furniture could be observed. Several family photos hung from the walls, and many of the antiques and other decorations were apple-themed. Apple Bloom gave a huff.
"They gotta be at the barn."
Atlas kneeled down. "All right, you meet them first. Tell them someone needs to talk to Twilight Sparkle. We'll be waiting here." Apple Bloom hopped off of Atlas.
"Why can't you go and meet her yourself?"
"Weren't we just at the town a few minutes ago?" Apple Bloom's mind flashed back to the moment in which she was looking up at Atlas, fear washing over her.
"Oh, yeah. Y'all make a good point."
Taurus and Mac kneeled down as well, letting Sweetie Belle and Scootaloo get back to their hooves again. The 3 fillies began to trot towards the barn, excitedly chatting with each other. Taurus let out a long sigh.
Ponies. I almost didn't make the connection, but weren't there ponies on Earth? Mac nodded.
Affirmative. Ponies were a miniature equine that used to live on Earth with humans. Though unlike those ponies, the ones on Earth did not show any signs of advanced intelligence, and were far less colorful.
There's too many coincidences. Same language, familiar facial structure, architecture. Atlas shifted his weight from one leg to another. The three remained silent for a second, then Taurus spoke up. Well, I guess we're lucky. We could have popped up right above a barren planet in the middle of nowhere, but at least there's plenty to go around in this place. Just, where is this place? Maybe we dimension jumped. Let's talk about something else. Atlas sighed deeply. He gave his surroundings a quick glance. Apple bloom. Apples. He chucked inwardly at the thought. Apparently these ponies were named after their profession, or something along those lines. He thought back to the moment where he stepped into the village, remembering that there was no sign of any advanced technology whatsoever, not even any sort of vehicles. Wooden buildings, a castle, kind of medieval. Of course, there's apparently also magic, something we haven't seen yet. Maybe they do have some surprises here and there, but probably far less than we have. Snapping out of his thoughts, Atlas peered around the corner of the farmhouse, shooting a quick glance towards the barn. He saw the three little fillies talking to someone who was inside. Then they turned around and began walking back to where he was, followed by two other ponies. Atlas got behind the farmhouse again, figuring it was a good idea to remain unseen for now, as to get this twilight sparkle as close as possible to avoid her running away. With Atlas's size, Taurus's featureless faceplate, and Mac's cold stare, they did not exactly look harmless after all. And who are these ponies? Asked Twilight as she and Applejack and the Keymark Crusaders walked towards the Apple family house. Applebloom looked up at her, sporting a slightly forced grin. They're not... She trailed off. It's a surprise, Skulu added. Sweetabelle piped up. Yeah, and it can't be a surprise if we tell you about it, can it? They received a rather angry snort coming from the orange mare. It better be a darn good surprise, muttered Applejack. The group was only a few steps short of rounding a corner to the house. The lavender mare was deep in thought. The Crusaders had managed to pry them out as Pinky's best friends forever and possibly last party, which had a sad aura about it, rather than Pinkie Pie's usual happy gathering, she had to admit. It was almost scary to see Pinky in such a depressed state. Well, she said out loud, it's not much of a surprise now that you've told us it's a surprise. She rounded the corner of the house. I mean, once you know it's a surprise, you logically won't be surprised. She was cut off when her head met an unmovable object, which produced a dull metallic bang against her horn and forced her to fall back on her haunches. It all happened in probably a second or two. She looked ahead and groaned, rubbing her forehead, noticing the two metallic beams that her head had collided with. No, that wasn't right. Those weren't beams, they were too complex. Her eyes slowly followed the length of the two objects, as they merged into a single shape whilst going upward, with some orange lights decorating the midsection and some sort of metallic pockets. Afterwards, they divided again into two more parts that hung loosely down the middle, and perched atop the object, there was a head, with a single orange slit that looked down at her. Wait, what? She glanced up and down. Legs, torso, forelegs, head. It was not an object, nor was it part of the barn. It was a breathing, living creature made of metal. Her eyes went wide. She noticed two more creatures stood behind the one before her. They were much smaller than it, but one of them had a pair of blue eyes that bore into her mind, and the other did not have anything, just a shiny orange dome for a head. She was wrong after all. The surprise did, in fact, surprise her.